Let's take a look at how the lockdown was lifted across Europe. Across Europe, lockdown measures are being lifted cautiously in phases. Businesses are reopening and many children are going back to school. Here is how Europeans are emerging from life under lockdown. Germany began reopening smaller shops in April. In early May, the responsibility for lifting the lockdown was handed to the 16 federal states. But Chancellor Angela Merkel stressed that an emergency brake will be applied anywhere that sees a surge in new infections. Bundesliga football matches resumed behind closed doors on 16th May, the first major European league to do so. Shops of all sizes were allowed to reopen, with extra hygiene and social distancing norms being mandatory. Shops smaller than 800 square meters have been allowed to open since the 20th April, alongside car dealerships, bicycle shops and bookshops. Schools have been partially reopened for younger children and those taking exams. Italy imposed a strict and lengthy lockdown on 7th March, initially in the north, then nationwide, with a ban on walking or exercising more than 200 meters, that is approximately 656 feet from home. In early May, some restrictions were relaxed and people were able to travel for longer distances, as well as visit their relatives in small numbers. On 3rd June, Italy unilaterally reopened its borders and ended regional travel restrictions. Bars and restaurants reopened on 18th May, but the number of diners reduced, with tables further apart and plastic shields to separate customers. Hairdressers also reopened on 18th May, as did more shops, museums and libraries, and sports teams were able to hold group training. Church masses resumed from that date as well, but with strict social distancing and wearing of face masks. Funerals are now allowed with a maximum of 15 people in attendance, ideally outdoors. Schools, though, will not reopen until September. France's strict lockdown was imposed on 17th March, with residents required to provide a travel permit justifying any outdoor trips. Nearly all of France is now in a green zone, a state from which state restrictions can ease faster. Paris has moved from a red to an orange zone. Bars and restaurants in green zones have been allowed to reopen under Phase 2, with outdoor spaces being allowed to open even if they fall under the orange zones. Parks and gardens in Paris can finally reopen. Primary schools and nurseries began reopening from 11th May and schools for 11 to 15-year-olds in green zones on 18th May. A limit of 15 pupils, though, has been put per classroom, and masks are compulsory for older children. Schools for 15 to 18-year-olds reopened in green zones as part of Phase 2. Gatherings of fewer than 10 people are also permitted. The elderly and vulnerable are allowed out but must use common sense. Beaches have also begun reopening under tight restrictions. Cinemas will start reopening on 22nd June. Denmark, one of the first European countries to announce a lockdown, started to ease restrictions from mid-April. Daycare centers and primary schools reopened on 14th April, although parents and visitors are not allowed in school premises, and children have to attend in shifts. Children aged 12 to 16 years, as well as those having to give exams, returned from 18th May. Hairdressers, beauty and massage salons, optometrists, podiatrists, and chiropractors reopened on 20th April. Professional sport is allowed behind closed doors, with Football Superliga returning to action on 28th May. Shopping centres reopened on 11th May, but with strict social distancing guidelines. Social gatherings are limited to 10 people. The three Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, became the first countries in Europe to allow free movement between countries, again, but only within the three of them. From 15th May, citizens and residents could move freely across the three countries, provided they had not travelled outside the Baltic states in the past 2 weeks, were not infected, and were not in contact with an infected person. Those coming from elsewhere still have to self-isolate for 14 days. However, Estonia has said that several countries would not be affected by this rule of self-quarantine from 1st June, including Germany, France, and Austria. Restrictions are slowly being lifted in Belgium, which saw a high number of deaths in care homes. Since 10th May, people in the same household have been allowed to receive visitors from a group of up to 4 people. New regulations require all Belgians aged 12 or over to wear masks on public transport. Fabric shops reopened on 4th May. Other shops reopened on 11th May with strict social distancing. Schools resumed classes from 18th May, but no more than 10 children are allowed in each classroom. The Netherlands imposed a far less strict lockdown than next door Belgium. A 5-phase plan for easing lockdown restrictions kicked in from 11th May. Libraries are now open again, and hairdressers, nail bars, beauticians, masseurs, and occupational therapists went back to work from 11th May. Bars and restaurants reopened on 1st June for up to 30 guests inside and unlimited number outside, provided people maintain a 1.5 meter distance among themselves. Cinemas, theatres, and concert halls also reopened, subject to a 30 guest upper limit. Face masks became mandatory on public transport from 1st June for anyone aged 13 and over. Secondary school pupils returned to class on 2nd June, with them having to maintain social distancing. Austria was one of the first countries to ease its lockdown. The country's health minister said the reopening of small shops in mid-April did not cause a spike in cases. The country opened its borders, except with Italy, on 4th June, and there is no requirement for undergoing a period of quarantine. Spain outlined a 4-stage plan on 4th May to start easing one of the strictest lockdowns in Europe, which saw children under 14 confined to their homes for 6 weeks. On 1st June, Spain moved to a second phase for 70% of Spaniards, but Madrid, Barcelona, and some other regions would remain under tighter Phase 1 restrictions. The state of emergency is to end on 21st June, restoring freedom of movement. Bilbao's world-famous Guggenheim Museum became Spain's first large museum to reopen its doors, though only 50% of its maximum capacity is allowed. Ireland has had a stricter lockdown than the UK, with residents only allowed to exercise within 2 kilometres, that is 1.2 miles, of their homes. But a 5-stage roadmap to reopen the country started on 18th May, with restrictions eased every 3 weeks. Schools will remain shut until September. Outdoor workers, such as construction workers and gardeners, resumed activities from 18th May. Meeting friends and family in groups of up to 4 is allowed within 5 kilometres of home, while anyone arriving in Ireland from abroad has to go into self-isolation for 14 days. Switzerland began easing its 8-week lockdown in stages from 27th April, with public gardens, hairdressers, and beauty salons allowed to reopen the same day. Schools, libraries, museums and non-food shops followed suit on 11th May with strict distancing measures. So too did restaurants, bars and cafes with a limit of 4 guests per table and with tables set 2 meters apart. From 30th May, groups of up to 30 people have been allowed to meet. Portugal has had fewer coronavirus cases and deaths than some other South European nations. Small neighborhood shops, hairdressers, car dealerships and bookshops started reopening from 4th May. Bigger shops, restaurants, museums and coffee shops reopened from 18th May but at reduced capacity. Small children and some secondary school students started going back to school on 18th May, but all other schools can continue only remotely. Shopping centers, cinemas and theatres will reopen in June, when office workers might also be gradually allowed to return. Greece recorded its first COVID-19 case on 26th February and the government acted swiftly to impose a lockdown. On 28 April, Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis announced a relaxation of lockdown measures in the weeks ahead. Churches opened for individual prayers on 4th May and mass religious services were allowed from 17th May. Schools reopened on 11th May for final year students only, that too with special measures including students attending classes on different days. On 1st June, classes resumed for primary schools and kindergartens with a maximum of 15 per class. Shops can also reopen now. President Vladimir Putin announced that Russia's nationwide lockdown was being eased from 12th May and that businesses could restart to stop unemployment from rising further. He also said it was up to individual regions to decide the best policy. But Russia's daily infection rate remains high compared to the rest of Europe. In Poland, COVID-19 numbers are lower than in many Western European countries. Most of the recent infections have been amongst the country's local coal miners in the southern Silesia region. Hotels, shops, shopping centers, museums and galleries reopened on 4th May with 1 customer per 15 square meter of space allowed. Face coverings in public will remain obligatory until a vaccine is available. Restaurants, cafes, hairdressers and beauty salons reopened from 18th May. There was no compulsory lockdown in Sweden, unlike the measures seen elsewhere in Europe. But in line with government advice, most people took to voluntary social distancing and working from home.